I think something is happening to the people in my town. It started slow at first. A few kids went missing from school. A handful of people didn't show up to work, but it's been getting worse. I'm a teacher at a high school in a small town in northern Utah. I suppose things started getting strange a few weeks ago, but I admit it very well may have started months ago. The change was incredibly subtle. I noticed that there were a few empty seats in my classroom. The halls were just a little less crowded. Then I started noticing the same things outside of work. The traffic isn't as bad as it used to be, even during rush hour, and the lines at the store are shorter. I began formulating this when last week, for the entire week, I had been missing 10 students. There weren't any missing persons reported, and the rational part of my mind argued that there was probably just some nasty strain of the flu going around, but as I mentioned it to my class, some of the students started chiming in that they hadn't heard from their friends since they stopped showing up at school. One girl, Tracy O'Brien, who had a large number of friends and male suitors, had all but vanished. Nobody had heard from her, even through Facebook or Twitter. I called the office to see if her parents had called in, but they hadn't been able to get in contact with anyone from the O'Brien home. I started to get worried. Something didn't seem right. There were a ton of kids missing, and Tracy was especially puzzling. It wasn't like her to go dark like that. I went to the address on her file after school that evening. I wanted to make sure that she and her family were all right and get the nagging feeling out of my mind. I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I could hear the television playing inside the house, but I couldn't detect any movement. I moved on to the backyard, hoping to find someone there. Instead, I found the exact opposite. The lawn was beginning to overgrow in some places and yellow in others. There were weeds sprouting in the flower garden, and the pump to the waterfall bird bath was humming with contempt from lack of water. I went up the deck stairs and knocked on the back door. I heard the television again, but I heard something else with it. It was the sound of water running through pipes. It sounded close to where I was. I knew in my heart that something had gone terribly wrong, and so I set my jaw and checked the knob on the door. It was unlocked. If I went inside and I was wrong, it could have meant my career, but a part of me somehow knew that wouldn't be the case. I twisted the knob and stepped into the house. The water that was running was the kitchen faucet to my right. On the floor in front of the sink was a smashed cell phone. I called out and announced myself as I took a step forward. "Is anyone here?" I picked up the phone and tried it. It looked like it had been thrown against a brick wall. I called out again, my pulse racing and chills running up from the base of my spine and tickling my scalp like the legs of 1,000 spiders. I explored the home further, making sure to call out in regular intervals just in case someone was home. But as I carried myself deeper inside, the hope of finding anyone was waning. I found Tracy's room and peeked my head in. It felt wrong to even step a foot into the girl's room, but that wasn't necessary. The room was a disaster. Clothes and makeup were strewn across the room. Some bottles of makeup were even smashed on the wall, making smears of skin tones across the otherwise white paint. I left her room and went back to the kitchen. I noticed the smell then that I'd previously overlooked. On the counter next to the oven was a boxed pizza that had obviously started frozen but had thawed, causing a puddle of water to form beneath it, and the cardboard box around it to become spongy. The water had since dried up, drawing his ring around the box, but the cardboard still seemed to be at least slightly moist. The pizza smelled acrid and dry, clearly having grown mold since it was placed on the counter. It was as if the whole O'Brien family had just disappeared from where they stood. There wasn't signs of packing, and there were cars in the driveway, but it was obvious that nobody had been home for quite some time. I left quietly, wiping down my fingerprints from the doorknobs before doing so, then moved on. I thought about calling the police, but with no evidence to support my claim other than the information I gained from trespassing in my student's home. I didn't think I had a leg to stand on. I will look into my other missing students. I hope they're all right, but in my heart, I know that something terribly wrong is happening in this town. I had a dream that night. I usually don't remember my dreams, nor am I the type of person to believe that dreams are anything more than what they are at face value. This one was particularly noteworthy. I dreamt of a woman. She was old and haggard, and her hair hung in her face in thick, greasy strands. She was thin, and her teeth were broken and jutted out in crooked angles. She sat atop me in my bed, straddling my chest with her knees on my shoulders. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was close my eyes and pray for deliverance. I can't say why, but in my dream I knew that if I opened my eyes, if her eyes caught mine in their gaze, I would find the same fate as the O'Brien family. When I awoke, I was alone in my bed, but my throat was sore, probably from screaming in my sleep, and my shoulders were stiff. I've read that sometimes a person's body can react to their dreams, playing them out in the physical world as a sort of elaborate sleepwalking episode, but I'd never experienced anything quite like this. I didn't fall back asleep that night. I lay in bed, afraid to fall back asleep and see the face of that woman, and thinking about the disappearance of Tracy and her family. After class that day, I sat down and made a list of everyone who had been absent for consecutive days. All 10 students had been missing from school for at least 48 hours, the longest one being Tracy O'Brien at a week. After a bit more digging in the office's files, I found that none of the students' parents had been able to be reached. The school's truancy officer had tried to get a hold of the parents via email, home phone numbers, and even a few of the work phones we had on file. He couldn't get a hold of anyone, and 2 of the people at the workplaces he spoke to told him they hadn't seen the parents of the missing students either. It was as if the whole family just up and left one day. I thought about contacting the police again, but I couldn't see much coming of it. There's nothing inherently illegal going on, nor is there anything that would merit a search warrant yet. It's not illegal for someone to just disappear, and the state of Utah requires a parent or legal guardian to file an official missing persons report for a minor. Essentially, the hands of the police would be tied in red tape. I visited a handful more of the students' houses. Nobody answered the door when I knocked, and I found nobody in the backyard. I didn't bother trying to gain access to anyone else's house. The last thing I needed was someone calling the police, because a high school teacher was breaking into his students' homes. I went home deflated and discouraged. As I sat at my kitchen table, sipping at a glass of whiskey and muddling around on my laptop, an idea came to mind that I hadn't considered before. I went to the internet and searched the names of the students on my list. Mostly I found pictures of parties and vacations, but eventually I fell onto something that would haunt my dreams for likely the rest of my life. It was one of those webcam videos that one of the students posted. His name was Gregory Paulson, and the video was called Requesting a Dream Interpretation. Gregory, I knew, was a bright kid with an eye toward psychology, so I wasn't at all surprised that he would be the kind of person that would dive further into his dreams than me. He sat in what I assumed was his bedroom. I could see a bed in the background and a Star Wars poster on the wall. He wore the Coke bottle glasses he was well known for, and as he spoke, I noticed that hiding behind those frames were dark bags under his eyes. First, he said, "I'll start with the woman. She's old, probably in her 80s or so, and has crooked teeth." As he went on to describe this woman, my pulse quickened. I could picture the image in my mind as if she were still on top of me with her thick strands of hair tickling my face. "I can't sleep, because when I close my eyes, she's all I see," Gregory continued. His voice had become shaky and his face blanched. "The reason I'm posting this is because just before the video started, I told my brother about it. He told me I was being stupid for being so afraid of a dream. But when I told him about the woman, he looked scared, and kicked me out of his room. I think he's seen her too. He took a few deep breaths, then told the camera that if anyone else had seen her to please get in contact with him. I scrolled down on the page and saw a surprising amount of comments. Nobody had said anything about knowing who he was talking about, but instead the comments were all saying to check out the top corner of the screen at 2:51, 2:51, 2:55. I scrolled back up and found the time in question. In the corner of the screen was a mounted television, and when I clicked play, I saw what everyone was talking about. In the reflection of the television stood the thin, crooked, yet unmistakable shape of an old woman. That night, as I slept, I dreamt again of her. Instead of holding me down in bed, she stood in the corner of my room, staring at me with white eyes in the darkness. When I woke up, I had two words on my lips that my mind was replaying. I think I'd been talking in my sleep, repeating two words over and over. Nanate Iantin Hippaku. I don't know what they mean, if anything at all, but even thinking about them fills me with a sense of dread. I took a drive to the nearest university, which was about an hour out of town, to consult the language specialist there. After speaking with several professors of language, it was ultimately a history professor that was able to identify the language. That's a Shoshone language, he told me almost at once. He was a professor of American history, and particularly specialized in that of the local Utah area. It's the language the Ute Indians used before the Mormons came in and took over. What does it mean? I asked him earnestly. I hadn't realized till that moment that I'd been hoping the words meant nothing at all, and they were just the midnight ramblings of a man who needed to get his head out of the clouds. Discovering that it was an actual language that I'd never, to my knowledge, heard before was far more disturbing. Loosely translated, it means dangerous old woman. Where did you say you heard it? I told him the story of how I woke up with those words on my mind, and the dreams that had been plaguing me and the missing people in town. You say she sat on your chest? He asked intently. I confirmed. He went on to explain a story I'd never heard before. It's not particularly American history, but most cultures have their own versions of the creature he went forward to describe. Mares, he called them, come from Norse and Germanic mythology. Sometimes depicted as a goblin-like creature, and other times described as an old woman, they were said to ride the chests of those asleep and conjure bad dreams, hence the genesis of the word nightmare. In some stories, they would even lure children out of their beds to devour them in the forests or cave where they lived, but more of the lore depicted them as creatures meaning no harm other than to cause bad dreams. I asked him if there was anything similar in Ute mythology. He told me there wasn't. After a silence, I saw his eyes light up and shine with a sudden revelation. There is, he said slowly, a creature from the Passamaquoddy Indians from back east. My heart began to beat in my chest and my palms grew sweaty. I knew that whatever he was about to suggest was closer than I'd ever been to figuring out what it was I was dealing with. They called them Skudakumuch. It means ghost witch, or sometimes woman in the cave. They were spirits of deceased shamans that practiced dark magic. They were said to come out at night and feast on the flesh and blood of the people. They lived in caves. And the only way to stop them was to burn them in their home, then bury their home under blessed soil. He stopped for a moment, eyeing me with a curious expression. You do know that these are just stories though, right? They were deterrents for the children so they wouldn't go out at night or dabble in things they shouldn't. I nodded and said I understood, but internally, I wondered where the line between fiction and fact was drawn. Driving back into town, I again noticed the lack of traffic. I also noticed that a handful of the locally owned shops weren't open. It was a Saturday, but the park had only a handful of people in it. The grocery store and pharmacy had maybe half a dozen cars between them, and so on. A dark feeling of dread was coming over me, like a storm cloud sweeping over the town. I thought about leaving for a little while. Maybe I'd go spend the weekend with my sister in Salt Lake or my brother in Evanston, but I couldn't bring myself to take the idea any further than just those two basic thoughts. I felt like I had a duty to discover what was happening to my town and the people therein, and I didn't think I could bring myself to abandon ship. When I arrived home, I ate a small dinner and took a hot shower. I've always been able to think best with the hot steam working on my muscles. As I lathered on the soap, I suddenly felt cold. Instinctually, I pulled back the side of the shower curtain to peek in the room. The bathroom door was just slightly ajar. I thought I'd closed it, but in my current state of mind, it was outstandingly possible that I'd nearly burned dinner as well. I stepped out, closed the door, then returned to the hot water to rinse the soap off. I lathered the shampoo through my hair, thinking about the ghost witch that the professor had told me about and considering exactly how crazy I would need to be to believe in such a thing. I stepped under the faucet and let the water crash against my skull, rinsing out the shampoo from my hair and running down my face. It was then that I felt the coolness again. Like the light breeze of a feather on my face, I could feel an iciness that contrasted against the steam in the shower. I could smell a sour, dry scent of rotten breath as it filled my nostrils. I raised my hands to wipe the soap and water from my face so I could open my eyes, and as I did so, I thought I felt my fingertips brush against something in front of me. It felt like cool leather. I wiped at my face hastily, trying to get the water from my eyes, and just when I was beginning to think it was too late, I opened my eyes. Before me stood nothing but an empty shower. I stepped out of the tub and grabbed a towel from the rack, feeling foolish for having a panic attack in the shower. I wrapped the towel around my waist and wiped my hand against the fogged mirror. As I did so, I saw a flash of a figure behind me that made my heart leap into my chest. I whirled around and saw nothing, and when I looked back to the mirror, whatever I'd seen was gone. I went back to the university to meet again with the professor. After my experience in the bathroom and the persistent nightmares, I'd started to wonder if perhaps there was something going on with the town, like a curse or a nearby burial ground, but it wasn't until 3 nights after our original meeting that I knew I had to go back. My dog usually sleeps in the other room, but that night he inexplicably slept by my side of the bed. I woke up to the low growl of the pit bull, followed by a sharp bark that stood the hair on my arms on end. He was staring out the window. I followed his gaze and saw the woman for just the fraction of a second. She peered in through the glass with her dark eyes, and I could see her teeth rotting in her mouth, but her breath didn't condense on the window. She must have been holding on to something, because my room is on the 2nd floor of the house, and I could see her back was arched and her knees bent forward like a spider as she clung to the house outside. I reached forward for the lamp, but the second the light was on, she was gone. My dog continued to growl for a few minutes though, and I didn't get much sleep the rest of the night. The following morning, I went outside to look at the window. I had to get the ladder out to get to the level the woman had been, but when I finally climbed up to the window, I felt chills run up my back. There were deep grooves, like claw marks, on the corners of the window where I imagined her feet and hands to be. That was when I decided to return to the university. The professor looked older than I remembered. His eyes were deeper set, and the skin on his face seemed to sag further. I asked him if it was a bad time, but he said it wasn't. He said he was getting ready to call me himself if I hadn't shown up. I sat down, and before he spoke, I knew what he was going to say. He'd seen her too. And that's precisely what he did say. He'd seen her the night before last and hadn't been able to sleep since. He said he did some research on shamans in the area, ones that may be linked to this spirit, and he thought he may have found something of use. He proceeded to tell me the story of the nameless woman. She was a shaman, or a priestess of sorts, in one of the Ute tribes a few miles south of where my town is now. He was a very well-known healer and was one of the wisest the tribe had ever known, but things went sour. After years of trying to have a child, she finally conceived, but when it was stillborn, she began to change. This woman allowed the darkness into her heart and mind and began to try to interfere with nature in ways that should never be even considered. She wanted to take back the life of her child that had been lost and was willing to do it no matter what it would cost her or the tribe. She began to practice dark magic, sacrificing young animals in the hope that it would appease the devil and that he would bring her son back to her. Eventually, she moved on to the sacrifice of young children. They would go missing in the woods and were found miles away. By this point in the story, she had isolated herself from the tribe with their bodies broken and their hearts ripped from their chests. It was thought for a while that it was a wolf, or the spirit of a wolf, that was taking the children. But one night a man saw her snatch a child from his bed and carry him out to the woods. A group of warriors was formed and sent out to dispatch of her. And that's when they found out what she'd been doing. She'd been eating the hearts of the children she took and had been bathing in their blood. To eat the flesh of a human is an unforgivable act, and according to the Native American belief, is said to conjure the spirit of the Wendigo. The warriors captured her in her cave and tied her up and buried the entrance with large stones and mud so that nobody could even hear her scream. When they came back to the tribe, they told the chief, and he had her name completely erased from their history, only to remain as a tale of caution. When his story was finished, I could feel a thickness in the air that hadn't been present when he started. After a while, I asked the question, "How do we kill her?" He told me he didn't know. There are countless stories of Skudakumooch and even more about Wendigos, but none that he knew of in which a hybrid existed. This, it seemed, was something that existed outside of legends. I asked him if he had any idea where the cave in which she was buried was. I thought that maybe if I could find that, I might be able to do something to stop her. He told me he didn't know, of course, because any record of where that was had been destroyed along with her real name. He suggested I look around to see if any construction had recently started, or perhaps a landslide down one of the mountains had opened up something that was best to stay closed. I told him I'd see what I could find and asked him if I could call him if I ran into anything. He told me I could, but he'd rather I didn't. He was afraid he was already too far into this ordeal and didn't care to go further if it wasn't extremely necessary. I agreed, although in my heart I knew that I wasn't going to be able to keep him out of it. There was too much going on and too many lives at risk.
That's the end of the story. Comment down your views about the story. And if you liked it, then give it a thumbs up. Also do subscribe for more content like this.